Welcome to Classic Car Chat. I'm Paul Watson, host and producer, and I'm here at Orphan Car Garage in Abington with John Wingle, proprietor and self-professed foster father to many classic cars. We're going to go inside and talk about some classic cars, so don't go away, and we'll be right back and have a Classic Car Chat. Well, here we have a beautiful classic car. John, you want to tell people what this is?
This is a 1959 Edsel Ranger.
Edsel Ranger. That was one of the introductory levels.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
There was the Pacer, the Ranger, the
Citation,
and the Corsair came first, right? And then the Citation was the big fancy mucky muck.
Right. Well, so in 1958, when the car was introduced, there were six different lines of. There were senior cars and lower cars. Two different frames, actually. One was longer than the other. The Ranger was always the baseline, and then you worked up from there, and I believe the Corsair was the top of the line, or the Citation. They were very similar. They were senior cars. The 58 sales, as we know now, are so dismal that by 1959 they had washed everything down. Everything was on one platform, and they only had the Ranger as the base model. I'm sorry, they didn't have they didn't have senior and lower cars. Yeah. Everything was on this platform. And this is the Ranger, which was still the base car.
Yeah. And they, not only that, but they had, the first year they had 3 station wagons as well.
Yep, the Villager station wagons. Yep, they had convertibles.
Convertibles.
Yep. Another misconception is that it's not a Ford Edsel. It's an Edsel. It was its own division within the Ford umbrella.
Of course, it didn't stay there too long.
It didn't stay there too long, 2.5 years, if that. But it had its own dealer network, its own central offices, completely separate from Ford and Lincoln Mercury. The whole idea in mind was that it was to compete with Pontiac and Oldsmobile over at General Motors. Instead, it competed more with its own line of cars, namely the Mercury. So if you went to buy a Mercury, you might have bought an Edsel instead. Kind of defeated the purpose. People were probably going to buy a Ford product anyway, but instead of buying the Mercury, they bought an Edsel. I don't think ultimately this car stole many sales away from General Motors, which was the whole idea from the start.
Yeah. Well, it was one of those things where people either loved it or hated it. And they didn't necessarily get all of the car built the way they wanted to do, because they had it on an assembly line that was already overtaxed.
Right.
And they had to squeeze the Edsels in as they could get them in there.
Yep.
And things just happened, like seals didn't leak. Well, they leaked, of whatever it was that was in them for lubrication or whatever. And
the tooling was, the biggest, it wasn't necessarily an unreliable car. It probably wasn't any less reliable than anything on the road from 1958 to 1959. Other things were going against it more so. 1958 it was introduced, and the U.S. was in the middle of a terrible recession. So new car sales were in the tank anyway. Secondly, the car was introduced at a higher price point than what they had originally planned. So it ended up being, in some cases, more expensive than a Mercury. And it was supposed to be a line just under Mercury, but above Ford. General Motors had an ingenious steps-through program to keep their customers in-house. You went from Chevy to Pontiac to Oldsmobile to Buick to Cadillac, and everybody knew that. Yeah. You aspired through the ranks. Ford wanted to do the same thing. They threw Edsel in there. Didn't market it properly, didn't price it properly. Its own dealers didn't know how to sell it against a Mercury, compare it against a Mercury. And then, of course, the recession, the pricing, the marketing, and the styling. It was very controversial styling, especially in 1958 with that horse collar grill.
The horse collar grill that they also call the Oldsmobile sucking a lemon. And other people call that ring around the thing, the toilet
seat grill. And
it was just the vertical grill with more grill going out this way. There was, we talked about this, a concept car from a gentleman who was in the aluminum business, trying to get car manufacturers to realize that they could make an entire car out of aluminum.
Yeah.
They made 3 versions of the concept car. They called it the Scimitar for some unknown, well, people have had their ideas as to what that was. And that had a vertical grill on it too, but it looked really classy. I mean, those cars really did look really classy, and they if somebody had picked up on that and used that design,
you don't know. Ford Motor Company spent an exorbitant amount of money on the design and planning of the Edsel. Focus groups, they thought they knew exactly what the American public wanted in a new car. So we don't know for sure, but they may have shown the focus groups a picture of that prototype vehicle from that gentleman that built the Scimitar, is it?
Scimitar, yeah.
With that grill, and maybe people liked it. But when Ford tried to do it, it kind of gave a different impression, I think, in the end. It was rather radical. If you go to Harvard Business School today, the professors there will teach you everything Ford did wrong in the marketing of the Edsel. To this day, it's known as one of the biggest automotive blunders in history. And it's really a shame because I think they're great cars.
Yeah, where along the line does an entire car division disappear after 2.5 years?
Not even 2.5 years, yeah. The fall of 1957 it was introduced, and by the fall of 1959 it was done. They actually did make a 1960 model Edsel, which by 1960 the grille would completely wash down.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. It looked just like a galaxy of 1960, but they made so few of them. Why did they even bother tooling for it? Because I think they might have come out in August, and by November that it was dead. Ford pulled the plug on the whole program.
Well, I tell you, some of the marketing materials I've seen that were supposed to be just in-house things only confused the dealers even more.
Well, dealers were very confused, yeah, and not very happy.
No, I mean, there was this one piece that I saw of a family in vacation in New York City in their Edsel, and they had a son with them, and the whole thing, he was complaining all the time about the fact that he didn't do what he wanted to do, and they didn't go where he wanted to go, and they spent more time walking around New York City than they did in the Edsel in that film.
In the film? Well, there's one example. There were some features of the 1958 that didn't carry over to 1959. This is a 1959, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
There was one feature in the 1958s that's rather iconic, and I don't know if you were going to bring it up, or I may as well bring it up now, the teletouch drive.
Teletouch drive, right.
You actually shifted the car through the hub in the steering wheel. It stayed stationary, and the steering wheel spun around it. So there was no clock spring needed for that to spin. It stayed stationary, and it was an automatic transmission, obviously. Yes. And you had all your push buttons right in the hub of the steering wheel. Pretty ingenious idea. I think it's pretty neat. I'm a little disappointed that they didn't use it for 1959. This has a traditional column shift automatic. Reason why is because it was rather troublesome.
Yes. It was an electromechanical thing too.
Yes.
You had little motors that were pushing little rods and things like that, and sometimes they just didn't work.
Exactly.
Now Chrysler, just about the same time, had a push-button transmission that was off on the dashboard.
Off to the left.
And it was a transmission with no parking gear on it, so you had to push it into neutral and pump the heck out of that parking brake.
Right. And I think they added, Chrysler came out with that in '57, and I think at some point they added a parking lever for the transmission under the dash that you pulled to lock the transmission, almost like a park setting, but it was a lever you pulled over and above the emergency brake.
Yeah. Now my family had a Plymouth Fury that had that push-button transmission, and it's a good thing our garage was nice and level, because that had no parking gear on that at all.
Right.
So now back to the Edsel. We're straying a little bit.
Yeah, we strayed a little bit there. Sorry about that.
Well, it's all good stories, though.
Most Rangers, because it was the base model, weren't as glitzy or dressy as this. That's one of the reasons why I like this car. You wouldn't know it was really a Ranger. It's a hardtop model, number one. So a lot of the Rangers you find from 58 and 59 and 60 will be a sedan. And by that I mean the sedan will have pillars. A sedan car has pillars. Even the two-door will have a pillar here, and the door frame will be completely enveloped by a pillar. This car is a hardtop model, so there's no pillar. And I like that design feature. That's one of the things that attracted me to this car. And it also has the two-tone paint. This particular blue is called Jetliner Blue. And I think it just kind of exemplifies the 50s
We
with
also
the white
mentioned-
spear.
We talked about last week when we came by that it's almost impossible to tell what model you're looking at unless you can see the name written on it,
Yeah.
which is back
Yeah.
down there.
Yeah.
Because the design, they all had these radical designs, and there was no separation between the models and the design that I could see.
Right.
And you're talking about the pillarless thing. I remember what we used to call that when I was a kid. They used to call that a convertible hardtop.
Yep, I've heard it referred to that as well. Yep. And you could get
not the real hardtop convertible like Ford had when it
no,
actually went
no, we
back
won't.
into the trunk.
That's a whole nother show.
Yeah.
You could get a four-door hardtop as well. So if this car could have potentially been a four-door with no pillar, which is really a neat thing.
Yeah.
Most of the Edsels you find will have pillars, especially the baseline Ranger. That's kind of what made this car so special to me. 58, very individual dashboard. I actually have a sample of the 58 dashboard out back there with sort of a Cyclops speedometer.
Oh, yeah,
that's spun. Really cool, very jet age.
Like a flying saucer.
Yeah,
type
very
of thing.
jet age dashboard. And by 59, Ford was like, the heck with it. They used the same dashboard on this car as they did in their full-size Fords, the Fairlane. I think they're practically interchangeable, except this says Edsel over on the left.
And that speedometer also had a nice
right.
little warning light on it to let you know.
Yeah,
You could set
the
the
speed
speed.
warning. Yeah,
You could
that
set the
was an
speed to wherever
option.
and that was a nice little thing.
Speedminder. Yeah, that was an option in 58. Yep.
I know of cars that came along after that where they had something similar, and it didn't light up and flash, but it gave you a little beep, 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 beep
Right.
to let you know you're going over your set speed.
You could get this car, believe it or not, in a six-cylinder form.
Yep.
A lot of the base Ranger models did come equipped with a straight six. I had one previously. I had a 59 Edsel Ranger, which really exemplified the Ranger name because it was base. It was a sedan two-door. It had manual steering and manual brakes and a manual transmission, 3-speed on the column, and that car had the straight six with a manual choke carburetor as well.
Oh my.
A lot of manual going on in that car. It had to have been, as I said to friends when I owned that car, this had to be the ad car. This had to be the car that they advertised, drive a new Edsel for $23.95. And when you went to the Edsel dealer, this is the car. I mean, bare bones, black wall tires, dog dish hubcaps. This, funny to believe that this is also a 59 Ranger and completely different. But my point is the six-cylinder in this car was very, very underpowered. My six-cylinder Edsel was not enjoyable to drive. You had to plan your pullouts into traffic.
Yeah.
This car's got the V8 and a 292 V8, which is perfectly potent enough. So, although the six-cylinder was a very good and reliable engine, I would suggest anybody that's in the market for an Edsel to kind of focus on a V8.
Yeah. And Edsel owners these days are really big fans of the cars. I mean, the Edsel Club is a huge club, and it's international in scope.
International.
Because there was something I read about a gentleman from Britain came over here to buy an Edsel and shipped it back over there so he could have it over there as a car as part of his collection.
One of the biggest questions I get when people see this car here is, one of the first questions they ask is, how hard is it to get parts? This car must be really hard to get parts for. Really not, because of what you just mentioned. There's a huge cult following for these cars all over the world, and a lot of people have saved parts. Sadly, a lot of them ended up in salvage yards because in the 1960s and 70s, these cars were laughed at for the most part, and fell into the wrong hands and became very, very inexpensive used cars. The next car we profile will be another example of that. So sadly, a lot of these ended up in salvage yards. But that can be a good thing because guys and girls had the foresight to save parts. And there's still a lot of a network you can actually find a lot of NOS parts for these cars. NOS meaning new old stock. Brand new Ford Edsel parts in the box.
Yeah,
there's more of those out there than you'd think.
I was just going to say that because people are smart. They take and they pull the old stuff off of there. They make the molds up and then start using those. Or doing the machining on other things that they get.
Mechanically, not an issue. This car is very Ford, so drive line is very typical Ford. Certain things are Edsel only mostly exterior trim and sheet metal. And there aren't a lot of guys that are reproducing stuff like you just mentioned for the Edsel, because they just not, even though they're wildly popular and have a cult following, they're not of the scale of a Chevelle or a Nova or a Mustang. So for someone to say, reproduce this fender molding, spend the money to tooling to reproduce this fender molding, they're going to have to sell a lot of those fender moldings to even make their money back that they invested into the tooling and to reproduce it. So there's not a lot of reproduction stuff out there for Edsel, but there's a lot of good used stuff. And like I said, still a lot of NOS new old stock out there to source. Thankfully, I didn't have to do any of that with this car. This is exactly how I bought it. I believe I'm the third owner of this car, and the second owner was an Edsel Club president. In Florida.
Well, that way you know you're getting a good deal.
Right. He knew what he was doing in Florida, and he had the car restored. He had bought it from the original family and had the car restored. So most of what you see on this car has been restored or replaced with like NOS. The Edsel name on the fenders, NOS. He was able to obtain brand new old stock stuff that was sitting on a dealer's shelf for 60 years, believe it or not. So he did all the hard work. I'm enjoying the glory of it now, and it's a great car to drive. We have a lot of fun with it.
Well, there's most of the story of the Edsel. We'll take a quick break and be back with something else.
Sounds good.
Just a moment.
Thank you.
Well, here we are, another car, another day, another dollar. And most people will recognize what this is, but tell them anyway.
This is a Chevrolet Corvair.
Corvair, it's not the Monza.
Corvair Monza.
Oh, it is the
This
Monza.
is a Chevrolet Corvair Monza, yeah. Last year, Corvair Monza. Last year, Corvair 1969.
Yeah, and this was another one of those things that was almost a failed experiment, but it went a little bit longer.
Yeah, so
People did seem to like them.
they were very popular at one point. Chevrolet sold over 2 million of these cars. People don't realize that. And they also built them from 1960 to 1969. A lot of people don't realize that either, although limited numbers from 67 on. And there's a reason why that happened. We'll get to that in a second.
And it was something like people weren't quite sure whether it was supposed to be an economy car or a sporty car because the Monza came out in the middle of the first year.
Yeah. Unexpectedly, unbeknownst to General Motors, the Monza that they introduced as a prototype at, I believe, the Chicago Auto Show in 1960 turned out to be a huge hit. It was a two-door version of their four-door Corvair. They put bucket seats in it, a floor shift manual transmission, and the public went wild for it. And that was a little, took GM a little bit by surprise, because that wasn't the original intention of the Corvair. It was a four-door, all of the early Corvairs were four-door sedans, grocery getter, economy cars, easy transportation, low money transportation, good on gas.
And the name, we got to tell them the name was a kind of a marriage of Corvette and Bel Air.
Right, right.
It makes you think it should have been somewhere in between the two, and price-wise it wasn't. It was below those two.
Yeah, it was the price leader for Chevrolet. So if you went to the Chevy dealer in 1960 and said, give me the cheapest car you have in the showroom, and the salesman would have brought you to a Corvair. The whole reason the Corvair was introduced was to compete with the likes of Rambler, AMC with Rambler, and of course the influx of imports, namely the Volkswagen Beetle. And the big three had nothing but big cars to sell. And so someone wanted a smaller economical car, they were buying a Rambler, or they were buying a Volkswagen, or some of the other European cars that were coming into the country at the time. So the big three decided they needed to compete. And Ed Cole was the father of the Corvair. He was over at General Motors. He decided to take a little bit of a different approach and go a little unconventional, of course, with the air-cooled rear engine, taking a little bit of a page out of the Volkswagen Beetle book. Ford went traditional with their Falcon, and Chrysler with their Valiant, more conventional small cars, but the Corvair kind of took its own path, and that's what I kind of appreciate about it.
Yeah, and some of the other little changes, there was no grille on the front.
No grill. Yeah.
And no grill on the rear.
Right.
So if you look at it quickly, you won't know which end is which.
Right. When I was a kid, I saw my first one from the school bus window, and I will admit that these cars were long out of production by that time. So as a 10-year-old boy looking out the window from the school bus, driving by a salvage yard in the town that I grew up in, and seeing one of these behind the chain link fence with no grill, and so low to the ground, and the car looked so odd to me, even in the late 1970s, early 80s, it just didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. Finally, I made the trip up there on my bicycle one day to see what it was, and I looked in the side and it said Corvair on the glove box door, and I still didn't know what a Corvair was. 10 years old in 1980, so I had to go home to my mother and say, "What's a Corvair?" And she said, "Oh, those blow up." I knew I wanted one. So when I was 15, I bought my first one. They're a little bit like potato chips. I've had at least one ever since, but I think the cars got a little bit of a bum rap for no reason. They were fantastic cars, and most people that I run into nowadays that had one back in the day, bought one new, I had one as a used car, had a lot of fun with it, and for the most part, I hear very positive stories about them.
It's funny, they didn't have too many models, because it was the coupe and the four-door, and the Monza, you couldn't tell that from one of the non-Monzas because they looked exactly the same.
So the Corvairs are basically broken into two generations. And if you're a Corvair person, you refer to them as earlies and lates. And the earlies was the 1960 to 1964 design, which was more of a boxy, traditional car of the day, if you even want to say that about a Corvair. The early model cars had a bigger breadth of models. You could get vans, panel vans, seated vans, Greenbriers that held 9 people. They had station wagons, convertibles, Monza Spiders with turbochargers, coupes,
which was
four
the
doors.
Version of the car, right?
Right.
One you'd always see in the rallies.
Right, exactly.
And the panels, I gotta say that my father had one. He was a plumber. He had a Ford truck or something like that for a long time, but he had to have racks put on the outside to hold the pipe because they're 12 feet long. And he loved the Corvan that he had.
Corvan, yep.
Because he could get the pipes all inside. The big problem I had when I would work with him is there were 3 levels of the interior flooring. And there was the floor, by the side door, which was way down in here. Then as you went back, there was another bump up, which was
back there still.
Well, the bench was back, but I think that was where they bolted the seats to for the passenger vans.
Right.
And then behind that, about this much further, was the deck.
Oh, you're right.
Where the engine was under. Yeah. And my father loved that because he could open the rear doors of the vehicle, take off the thing, and actually work on the engine without having to lean way over a fender or something like that to get in there at it.
Right. They did really well with the early Corvairs. Competition stiffened, though, by the mid-1960s. Even within General Motors themselves, they introduced more compact cars. In '61, they introduced the senior compacts, the Tempest, the F-85, and the Buick Special. So they ended up competing with themselves with the Corvair. So by the second generation, which came out in 1965, which is this design, the lates, as the Corvair guys call them, they had really washed down the amount of models you could get. There were no more station wagons, there were no more vans. 65 was the last year for the van. Only a convertible, a coupe, and a 4-door. And it was a 4-door hardtop. And even that was discontinued after 67. Last 2 years, the car was alive. It was just available in 2-door and convertible form. So they had gone from all these models in the early 1960s, 61, 62, 63, and by 1968, there was 2 models left. Yeah. They were phasing it out.
They had some other interesting things going on, too. When we were talking about the van, and they had a pickup truck they called the side load, which had a tailgate on the side of the car so you could...
Yeah. That was actually considered a ramp side. They called that a ramp side. It actually was a ramp that folded down, and you could, the idea was that you could wheel up into the bed a lawnmower, a large appliance. It actually worked out pretty good. And a lot of appliance stores used them as fleet vehicles.
And they actually had a little conceptual thing that they were trying to do. They built from one of those ramp sides and just got
the amphibious.
The amphibious version, and you just take a look at the two of them, And they're almost exactly the same, except, you get down on the underside and you can see where the howling was attached to the thing.
It wasn't, I don't believe that was a GM design. I think there was an outside company that designed that vehicle, but when he showed it to GM, they showed some interest in it. Yeah. And I know of at least one that still survives. It's in a museum.
And they did do plenty of shooting of film footage on the thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So got some nice footage here that we will have, and showing the thing going through the water.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to seeing that myself.
It's like the aqua car that came along a little bit later. That was
Amphicar.
Amphicar. Yeah. That you can see the guy driving down the boat ramp right into the water. Never had to stop, except you had to flip the switch to go from the rear wheel drive to the propeller drive.
There's a place in Florida where you can go and go on a ride in an Amphicar. I think they've got 12 or 13 of them that you can rent a ride in an Amphicar. It's one of the parks in Florida. Yeah. A friend of mine actually did it. I guess when the doors seal properly, it's not a bad ride. I'd just be worried that those door seals 60 years later are failing. Yeah. I think it's difficult to talk about the Corvair without talking about one particular person, though, don't you?
You got to do it. You got to do it because everybody. That's one of the big things that went wrong for Corvair was that one guy and his one book.
Yep.
And even with the studies that were done later on, it proved that he wasn't accurate in anything he said. No. It still has taken on a life of its own.
So a young consumer advocate in 1965 thought he could take on the big company of General Motors, and he published a book that came out in 1965 just as this redesigned Corvair was being introduced, which is a knockout, by the way, as far as design, as far as I'm concerned. And the book was called Unsafe at Any Speed. In one chapter, I believe it's chapter 2, he really picks apart the early model Corvair, the first 3 years of the Corvair to be exact. And it's mostly its swing axle design in the back. The car had a lot of oversteer, but any rear-engined, rear-wheel drive car is going to have oversteer. Any car. And
yeah, because you got all that weight in the back end.
Yeah, all the weight in the back end. And granted, Americans weren't used to that. So maybe sometimes they'd get themselves into a little bit of trouble for that reason. Also, because all the weight is in the rear on these cars, tire pressure is very important. And the dealers made that very important, and it's spelled out very clearly in the owner's manual. But back then, just like today, people don't read their owner's manuals or pay attention to things like that. So they could get themselves into a little bit of trouble, especially at highway speeds with a lot of wind. Ralph Nader took that and ran with it, and I think the car undeservingly got a bad rap because of Ralph Nader. Car had really good sales in 1965 with the redesign. By 1966, they had fallen way off. Ralph Nader's book had a lot to do with it, but not everything to do with it, because also in 1966, Ford couldn't keep Mustangs in stock. Yeah. And the Corvair technically was in the same class as a Mustang. And the Mustang, you could get a V8 under the hood. It was
especially the Monza, because that was designed as a sporty car anyway.
Yeah. So, the word has it, and I can't say for sure, but I want to believe it, that it's true. Chevy realized early on that they couldn't compete with the likes of the Mustang and the GTO with the Corvair. Being a rear-engine vehicle, there was only so much they could do with it. They put a turbocharger on it, but they weren't putting a V8 back there. You could get a V8 with the Mustang, the GTO, and they knew that that's what the public wanted now. So they quickly went to work to design the Camaro that was going to be coming out in 1967. It was decided in like 1965 or 64 that this car was going to end in 1966 or 67 with the introduction of the Camaro. But keep in mind that Ralph Nader's book came out late 1965. So if they kill the car in 1966, it's kind of admitting defeat.
Yeah.
So because of Ralph Nader and because of Unsafe at Any Speed, it's been said that General Motors kept the car in production a bit limited amounts right up until 1969, rather than to have egg on their face and say that they ended up killing the car because of Ralph Nader, which of course would not have been the truth. They were going to replace the car with the Camaro. Camaro was a lot less expensive to build than this car. I mean, the list goes on and on. So because of Ralph Nader, we're standing here in front of this car. This is a 1969.
They did some promotional film. I don't know what the date of it was, where they demonstrated the Corvair driving in all kinds of circumstances.
Yeah.
They even tried to flip it over.
The National Highway
couldn't
Safety
do it.
Bureau cleared the car and General Motors of any wrongdoing in, I believe, 1972. But by then the car was done, and it had its reputation, unfortunately. And just like the Edsel we talked about earlier, these cars became very, very inexpensive used cars in the 70s. I mean, under $100 you could buy one. Chevy dealers didn't want to work on them anymore. Chevy dealers wouldn't take them in trade because they couldn't sell them. Thankfully, they've had a resurgence, and they're really coming on strong now, especially the late model 65 to 69 designs. The collectors are starting to take a look at them now where they hadn't for decades.
There's also a very big Corvair club, too.
Yep. Corvair Society of America. Yeah. I've been involved in that club since 1988. Yeah. This particular car is special. This is a 1969. They only built 6,000 Corvairs in 1969. John DeLorean became the president of Chevrolet in 1968. He came over from Pontiac. He was the father of the GTO. Chevrolet took him in 1968, and he hated the Corvair, and there was no buts about it. He didn't like the Corvair. So by 1969, the car was nearing the end of its life. He ordered the cars off the assembly line because these were, believe it or not, built on the same assembly line as the Nova in 1968 and early 1969. And this car came down the line, it would slow production down because it was completely different than the Nova. So everybody had to say, oh, there's a Corvair, and stop and read, oh no, I need this instead. So John DeLorean said, get those things off the line. He knew they were done anyway, and he didn't like the car. So the last 4,000 Corvairs that were built were basically hand assembled in a retooled, remodeled cafeteria in the back of the Willow Run assembly plant in Michigan. They basically took over an old cafeteria to build Corvairs in. And there was a Corvair, they called it the Corvair room. There was a team of guys that were specifically to build only the Corvair, not jump from line to line. So the last 4,000 cars of the 6,000 or 3,500 cars are basically hand-built cars. This is one of those cars. What makes this so special, of the 6,000 Corvairs built, only 521 of them were convertibles. The rest of them were two-door coupes. This particular car, if you haven't noticed already, is a real striking green. This is called Rally Green for 1969. It's in the Chevrolet Sports Department catalog as a sports car color because it wasn't available on Corvair. It was only available on Camaro and Nova SS, Rally Green. The gentleman that ordered this car new got central office approval, COPO, they call it a COPO, central office production order, to have his Corvair painted Rally Green. As far as we know, and General Motors records weren't that good, especially on the Corvair at the end because they were kind of ready to, this is the only 69 Corvair painted Rally Green. It's the only one known in existence. From the factory, this car was painted this color, which normally was only available on Nova and Camaro. So that makes this car extra special too. Bought this indirectly from the original family. It only has 48,000 miles on it. So even in 1969, the owner had foresight enough to save it because he knew it was special.
And that does make it special.
It does make it special, at least to me. It's kind of the holy grail. I've owned many, 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 many Corvairs, but I'm happy just to have this one at this point because it's kind of like the holy grail to me.
And it's people like you that are going to keep the Corvairs going.
I'm just a caretaker. This car is going to outlive me. Every car in here, I'm just a caretaker for it. They've been here before me, and they're going to be here long after me. And it's up to me to find the next caretaker for cars like this that's going to preserve them into the future.
Okay, well, that's the Corvair story.
Thank you.
So, thanks, John. Well, that's all we have for this week on Classic Car Chat. If you have any comments or questions you'd like to ask us, send an email to info@whca.tv and put Classic Car Chat in the subject line. We hope you enjoyed John and my little chat about two great classic cars. And if you did, keep your eye out because there'll be more episodes coming along. And we hope to see you next time on Classic Car Chat.